The blazing sun seemed to mock her as Zoe Alden collapsed beside her broken wagon, the wooden wheels splintered beyond repair. Her canteen lay empty at her side, and the lone horse she'd managed to keep hitched had died hours ago, overcome by thirst and exhaustion. The vast Texas desert stretched endlessly around her, shimmering with heat as the summer of 1875 proved to be one of the most merciless in memory. Sweat trickled down Zoe's neck as she shielded her eyes, searching the horizon for any sign of life. Her journey to San Antonio from St. Louis had turned into a desperate fight for survival when her traveling companions had abandoned her after an argument about their route. At 23, with nothing but the clothes on her back and her mother's locket around her neck, Zoe wondered if this barren landscape would be her final resting place. The world began to blur at the edges of her vision. She knew the signs of heat exhaustion well enough. Her father, before his passing, had warned her about the dangers of the Western Territories. "Water is more precious than gold out there," he'd said. Now she understood with painful clarity what he'd meant. As consciousness began to slip away, Zoe thought she heard the distant rhythm of hoofbeats. A hallucination, surely the desert's final cruel joke. But the sound grew louder, more insistent, until it could no longer be denied. With the last of her strength, she raised her arm and waved it weakly before collapsing onto the scorched earth. Ethan Vance spotted the broken-down wagon from nearly half a mile away. After 15 years of riding the trails between his ranch and San Antonio, he'd developed an eye for trouble on the horizon. Something about the stillness of the scene made him dig his heels into his stallion's flanks, urging the animal to a faster gallop. As he drew closer, he saw her, a woman lying motionless beside the wreckage, fair hair matted with dust, skin reddened by the relentless sun. Dismounting quickly, Ethan knelt beside her and gently turned her over, feeling for a pulse at her neck. "Still alive," he murmured, relief washing over him. "Madam, can you hear me?" The woman's eyelids fluttered, revealing startling blue eyes that struggled to focus on his face. Her cracked lips parted, but no sound emerged. Without hesitation, Ethan reached for his canteen. "Small sips," he instructed, supporting her head as he tipped the container to her mouth. She drank desperately, and he had to pull the water away. "Not too fast. You'll make yourself sick." "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw. "I thought I was going to die out here." "Not today," Ethan said firmly. He assessed the situation quickly: the dead horse, the irreparable wagon, and the woman's weakened state. "My ranch is about 5 miles from here. Can you ride?" She nodded weakly. "I think so." Ethan helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed. "What's your name?" Zoe Alden." "Ethan Vance," he replied, guiding her to his horse. "Where were you headed?" "San Antonio," she managed, wincing as he helped her into the saddle. "I was supposed to take a position as a school teacher." Ethan mounted behind her, one arm securing her waist as he took the reins with his free hand. "San Antonio's still a day's ride from here. First, we need to get you somewhere safe." As they rode, Ethan felt Zoe leaning more heavily against him, her body occasionally going limp as she drifted in and out of consciousness. He urged his horse to a faster pace, worried about the signs of severe heat exposure. The desert had claimed too many lives over the years. He wouldn't let it take hers. The sun was beginning its descent when the Vance Ranch came into view, a sprawling property with a modest but well-maintained main house, a barn, and several outbuildings. Cattle grazed in the distance, and a small creek cut through the property, fed by an underground spring that had made this parcel of land so valuable when Ethan had purchased it 8 years ago. "Miss Alden," Ethan said, giving her a gentle shake. "We're here." Zoe stirred, raising her head to take in their surroundings. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "Like an oasis." The front door of the house swung open as they approached, and an older woman with silver-streaked hair hurried down the steps. "Ethan, you're back early." She stopped short when she noticed Zoe. "Good heavens, what happened?" "Found her stranded about 5 miles out, Martha," Ethan explained as he dismounted, then carefully helped Zoe down. Her wagon broke down and she's suffering from the heat. Martha clucked her tongue sympathetically. The poor dear. Bring her inside right away. Ethan swept Zoe into his arms when her legs buckled beneath her. She was lighter than he expected, and he could feel her ribs through the fabric of her dress. How long had she been out there before he found her? Martha led them to a spare bedroom on the first floor, pulling back the covers as Ethan gently laid Zoe on the bed. "I'll fetch cool water and cloths," Martha said, already moving toward the door. "And some broth if she can manage it." Left alone with Zoe, Ethan pulled a chair to the bedside. Her eyes were closed again, but her breathing seemed steadier. "Miss Alden," he said softly, "Martha's going to help get you cooled down and comfortable. She was a nurse during the war. You're in good hands." Zoe's eyes fluttered open. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's weathered face softened. "Out here, we don't leave folks to die in the desert. It's not our way." Martha returned with a basin of water, clean cloths, and a glass of water with a hint of salt and sugar mixed in. "This will help restore what you've lost," she explained, helping Zoe take small sips. As Martha tended to Zoe, Ethan excused himself to see to his horse and to retrieve what he could from Zoe's wagon. By the time he returned to the house with a small trunk, the only salvageable item from the wreckage, night had fallen, and Martha was exiting the spare room. "She's resting now," the housekeeper informed him. "I've given her some broth and changed her into one of my nightgowns. The poor thing is exhausted, but I believe she'll recover with proper care." "Thank you, Martha," Ethan said sincerely. "I'll ride into town tomorrow to send word to San Antonio about her situation." Martha nodded, then fixed him with a knowing look. "She's quite lovely, isn't she?" "Even in that state." Ethan cleared his throat, ignoring the observation. "I found this trunk in her wagon. Would you see that it gets to her room?" That night, as Ethan sat on his porch watching the stars emerge, he found his thoughts returning to Zoe Alden. There was something about her, a determination that had allowed her to survive when others might have perished. He'd seen it in the set of her jaw even as she'd fought to remain conscious. San Antonio would have to wait for their schoolteacher. For now, Zoe Alden had found refuge at the Vance Ranch, and Ethan was surprised to discover that he was in no hurry to see her leave. Morning arrived with the gentle sounds of life stirring around the ranch. Zoe opened her eyes to unfamiliar surroundings, momentarily disoriented until the events of the previous day came flooding back. The broken wagon, the blistering heat, the certainty of death, and then the cowboy who had appeared like a mirage on the horizon. She attempted to sit up, relieved to find the dizziness had subsided. A glass of water sat on the bedside table, and she drank it gratefully. Her trunk had been placed at the foot of the bed, and Zoe felt a rush of appreciation for her rescuer's thoughtfulness. A soft knock at the door preceded Martha's entrance. The housekeeper's face brightened when she saw Zoe sitting up. "Well now, you're looking much improved this morning," she said cheerfully, setting down a tray with a bowl of porridge and a cup of coffee. "How are you feeling, dear?" "Much better, thank you," Zoe replied, her voice stronger than it had been the day before. "I don't know how to express my gratitude to you and Mr. Vance." Martha waved away her thanks. "No need for that. Ethan would never have left anyone in such a state, least of all a young lady like yourself." She busied herself opening the curtains to let in the morning light. "He's gone to send word to San Antonio about your delay, but he said to tell you there's no rush. You're welcome to stay until you're fully recovered." Zoe felt a flutter of uncertainty. "I wouldn't want to impose." "Nonsense," Martha said firmly. "This house has been too quiet for too long. Now, eat your breakfast, and if you're feeling up to it later, I've laid out one of my dresses for you. It might be a bit large, but it's clean and will do until we can see about getting your things washed." After breakfast, Zoe dressed in the borrowed clothes, a simple blue calico dress that hung loosely on her frame, but felt wonderfully clean after days of travel in the same dusty garments. With Martha's permission, she ventured outside to the porch, where a rocking chair offered a view of the ranch activities. From her vantage point, Zoe could see several ranch hands working with cattle in a distant pen, while others tended to chores around the barn and stables. The property was larger than she had initially realized, stretching toward the horizon where it met the rugged landscape beyond. Her attention was drawn to a rider approaching from the east, Ethan Vance, his tall figure unmistakable even at a distance. There was an ease to the way he sat in the saddle, as if he and the horse were a single entity moving across the land. As he drew closer, Zoe found herself straightening in her chair, smoothing the borrowed dress over her knees. Ethan dismounted near the house, handing his horse's reins to a young ranch hand before climbing the porch steps. He removed his hat as he approached, revealing dark hair streaked with the occasional silver strand. "Miss Alden," he greeted her, genuine pleasure in his voice. "It's good to see you up and about." "Mr. Vance," she returned with a smile. "I can't thank you enough for what you did yesterday, if you hadn't come along when you did." "Let's not dwell on what might have been," he suggested, leaning against the porch railing. "I've sent word to San Antonio about your situation. The school board understands and says your position will be held for you until you're able to take it up." Relief washed over Zoe. "That's wonderful news. I was worried they might give it to someone else." "They're eager to have you," Ethan confirmed. "Apparently, qualified teachers willing to venture this far west are in short supply." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of the rocking chair as Zoe shifted. "Martha tells me you're from St. Louis," Ethan said finally. "That's a long journey to make alone." Zoe's expression dimmed slightly. "I wasn't alone when I started. I joined a group heading to San Antonio, but we disagreed about the route. They wanted to take a shortcut through territory known for Apache raids. I refused, and they left me behind." Ethan's jaw tightened. "They abandoned a woman in the desert over a disagreement about directions." "They thought I was being overly cautious," Zoe explained, though there was no real defense for their actions. "I had enough provisions for what should have been a 2-day journey to the next town, but my horse pulled up lame, and then the wheel broke." "You made the right choice," Ethan said firmly. "That shortcut has cost many lives. If they took that route, they may have faced worse than a broken wagon." Zoe nodded, grateful for the validation. "May I ask how long you've had this ranch? It's quite impressive." Ethan's expression softened as he looked out over his property. 8 years now. I came west after the war needed open spaces and a fresh start. Worked as a trail hand for a few years, saved every penny, and eventually had enough to buy this place. It wasn't much then, just a small cabin and some decent grazing land. The underground spring was the real prize. "It's beautiful," Zoe said sincerely, "like finding water in the desert." Ethan smiled at her choice of words. "That's exactly what it is, Miss Alden. An oasis in this unforgiving country." He glanced at her, noting the color returning to her cheeks. "If you're feeling stronger tomorrow, perhaps I could show you around the property." "I'd like that very much," Zoe replied, surprised by how much she meant it. The following day dawned clear and slightly cooler, with a breeze that offered respite from the typical Texas heat. Zoe dressed in her own clothes, which Martha had kindly laundered for her, and met Ethan in the courtyard where he waited with 2 saddled horses. "Are you sure you're up for riding?" he asked, concern evident in his expression. Zoe approached the smaller of the 2 horses, a gentle-looking mare with a chestnut coat. "I grew up riding," she assured him, "and I feel much stronger today. Besides, I'd like to see this oasis of yours properly." Ethan helped her mount, his hand strong and steady as he assisted her into the saddle. Once she was settled, he swung easily onto his own horse, a muscular black stallion that stood at least 17 hands high. They rode at an unhurried pace, Ethan pointing out features of the ranch as they went the creek that ran through the property, fed by the underground spring, the grazing lands where his cattle fattened on native grasses, the distant line of cottonwood trees that marked the boundary of his land. "How many cattle do you run?" Zoe asked, genuinely interested in the operation. "About 800 head," Ethan replied. Not the largest herd in the territory, but quality over quantity has served me well. I've been focusing on breeding stock that can withstand the Texas heat better than most. As they crested a small rise, Ethan reined his horse to a stop. Below them, partially hidden among a stand of trees, was a small, clear pool of water surrounded by lush greenery, a stark contrast to the arid landscape around it. The heart of the spring, Ethan explained as they dismounted. Most of the water runs underground, feeding the creek and keeping the land fertile, but this pool has been here as long as anyone can remember. Zoe approached the water's edge, marveling at its clarity. Wildflowers grew along the banks, their colors vibrant against the green grass. It's like something from a fairy tale, she said softly. I never expected to find such beauty in the midst of all that harshness. Ethan watched her, struck by the wonder in her expression. That's what drew me to this place. The contrast between struggle and abundance, between scarcity and plenty. They sat on a fallen log near the pool, the horses grazing contentedly nearby. Ethan produced a small bundle from his saddlebag: bread, cheese, and dried fruit that Martha had prepared for their outing. As they ate, Zoe found herself sharing stories from her childhood in St. Louis, her father's work as a doctor, her mother's death from influenza when Zoe was 16, and her decision to become a teacher after spending years helping at her father's practice. When my father passed away last year, there was nothing keeping me in St. Louis, she explained, brushing crumbs from her skirt. I'd always dreamed of seeing more of the world, and when I saw the advertisement for a teacher in San Antonio, it felt like an opportunity to start fresh. Ethan nodded, understanding in his eyes. Sometimes the hardest thing is staying in a place filled with memories. Exactly, Zoe agreed, surprised by his insight. What about your family, Mr. Vance? Do they still live back east? A shadow crossed Ethan's face. Lost my parents to typhoid when I was young. My aunt raised me in Virginia until I was old enough to enlist, after the war. He trailed off, his gaze distant. Let's just say there wasn't much left of the world I knew. Zoe sensed there was more to his story, but she didn't press. The war had left deep scars on so many, and some wounds were best left undisturbed. Well, she said after a moment, I think we've both found something new out here, haven't we? You with your ranch and me. She looked around at the peaceful scene. Even if it's just a temporary respite on my journey. Something flickered in Ethan's eyes, a momentary hesitation before he nodded. Yes, I suppose we have. They stayed by the spring longer than planned, the conversation flowing easily between them as the sun traced its path across the sky. By the time they returned to the ranch house, the afternoon was waning, and Zoe was surprised to realize how quickly the day had passed. Martha greeted them with knowing eyes as they dismounted. I was beginning to wonder if you'd gotten lost, she teased, though there was no real admonishment in her tone. Miss Alden was getting acquainted with the property, Ethan explained, a slight flush visible beneath his tan. And a fine property it is, Zoe added, smiling at the housekeeper. Though I believe I could use some rest now. The ride was more tiring than I anticipated. That evening, after supper, Zoe found Ethan on the porch again, smoking a pipe as he gazed at the stars. She hesitated in the doorway, not wanting to intrude on his solitude, but he turned at the sound of her footsteps. Join me, he invited, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. Zoe settled into the rocker, drawing her shawl closer around her shoulders against the evening chill. The nights here are so clear, she observed, looking up at the vast canopy of stars. In St. Louis, the city lights often obscured all but the brightest stars. One of the advantages of being miles from civilization, Ethan agreed, though I imagine there are comforts of city life you must miss. Zoe considered this. Some, perhaps, good bookshops, theater performances, the bustle of market day, she smiled. But there's a peace here that I never found in the city, a sense of possibility. Ethan turned to study her profile in the dim light from the house windows. You surprise me, Miss Alden. Most city folk who find themselves out here can't wait to return to their paved streets and proper society. Perhaps I'm not most city folk, she replied lightly. Or perhaps nearly dying in the desert has given me a new appreciation for simpler pleasures. Ethan chuckled, the sound warm in the quiet night. A brush with mortality does tend to clarify one's priorities. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the distant howl of a coyote, the soft nickering of horses in the stable, the creaking of the house as it settled. When do you think you'll be well enough to continue to San Antonio? Ethan asked finally, his voice carefully neutral, Zoe's hands stilled in her lap. I suppose I could leave in a few days if the offer of transportation still stands. She hesitated. Unless my presence here is becoming a burden. No, Ethan said quickly, emphatically. Not at all. You're welcome to stay as long as you need. He cleared his throat. I just thought you'd be eager to take up your position at the school. The school year doesn't begin for another month, Zoe said slowly. I was traveling early to have time to settle in, prepare my lessons. She glanced at him. There's no immediate rush. Relief flickered across Ethan's features before he schooled his expression. Well then, perhaps you'd like to see more of the area while you recover your strength. There's a small town about 10 miles from here, nothing like San Antonio, but they have a decent general store and even a lending library of sorts. That sounds wonderful, Zoe said, genuine enthusiasm in her voice. I'd hate to impose on your time, though. You must have important work to attend to. Ethan tapped his pipe against the porch railing, emptying it of ash. The ranch won't fall apart if I take a day away from it. My foreman, Jose, is more than capable of handling things in my absence. As the days passed, Zoe found herself slipping into the rhythm of life at the Vance Ranch. She accompanied Ethan to the nearby town of Clearwater Springs, where she was introduced to the local merchants and residents as Miss Alden, the school teacher who will be teaching in San Antonio come fall. The townsfolk welcomed her warmly, particularly the proprietor of the general store, Mrs. Calloway, who insisted on showing Zoe her small collection of books available for borrowing. We don't have much compared to what you're used to, I'm sure, Mrs. Calloway apologized, but folks out here are just as hungry for stories and knowledge as anywhere else. It's a wonderful service you're providing, Zoe assured her, selecting a well-worn copy of Jane Eyre to borrow. Books are windows to worlds we might never otherwise see. On the ride back to the ranch, Zoe found herself sharing her thoughts on education with Ethan. So many children out here have limited access to formal schooling, she mused. It seems a shame. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. There's been talk of establishing a school in Clearwater Springs, but finding a qualified teacher willing to come this far from civilization has been the stumbling block. Zoe turned the idea over in her mind, saying nothing but filing away the information for later consideration. As 1 week stretched into 2, Zoe began to help around the ranch house, initially to Martha's protests, and then to her grudging appreciation. They worked together in the kitchen garden, preserving summer vegetables for the coming winter months and baking bread in the large cast iron oven. You've got a good hand with pastry, Martha commented one afternoon as they removed a perfectly golden apple pie from the oven. Most young ladies these days consider cooking beneath them. My mother believed every woman should know how to feed herself and those she cares about, Zoe explained, setting the pie on the windowsill to cool. Status or wealth doesn't change that basic need. Martha nodded approvingly. A sensible woman, your mother. Ethan, returning from a day of work with the cattle, found them laughing together in the kitchen. He paused in the doorway, struck by the domestic scene and the way Zoe's presence had transformed the house in just 2 short weeks. Something smells delicious, he said, announcing his presence. Both women turned, and Ethan couldn't help but notice the way Zoe's face brightened at the sight of him, a flush coloring her cheeks that had nothing to do with the heat of the kitchen. Apple pie, she informed him, though you'll have to wait until after supper to try it. A cruel punishment, he lamented, making a show of dejection that had both women laughing again. That evening, as they enjoyed slices of the pie on the porch, Ethan broached a subject he'd been considering for several days. "There's to be a social gathering in Clearwater Springs this Saturday," he said, trying to sound casual. "A summer dance at the town hall. Would you? That is, if you're feeling up to it, would you care to attend? With me?" Zoe looked up from her plate, surprise and pleasure mingling in her expression. "A dance?" Ethan shifted in his chair, suddenly feeling like an awkward schoolboy rather than a man of 36 who owned one of the most prosperous ranches in the county. "It's nothing fancy like what you're probably used to in St. Louis. Just local families getting together for some music and dancing, but I'd love to," Zoe interrupted, saving him from his rambling explanation. "It sounds wonderful." The smile that spread across Ethan's face was bright enough to rival the setting sun. "Excellent. I'll make sure the buggy is in good condition for the trip." Saturday arrived with a sense of anticipation that had been absent from the Vance Ranch for years. Martha helped Zoe prepare, lending her a necklace of polished turquoise to complement the blue dress Zoe had rescued from her trunk. "You look lovely, dear," Martha said, stepping back to admire her handiwork after helping Zoe pin her hair into an elegant arrangement. "Ethan won't be able to take his eyes off you." Zoe blushed. "I'm sure Mr. Vance is just being kind, offering to take me to the social. It must be tedious for him, having a stranded schoolteacher underfoot for so long." Martha's knowing smile suggested she thought otherwise, but she said nothing more as she ushered Zoe downstairs where Ethan waited. The transformation in Ethan was striking. Gone were the dusty work clothes and weathered hat, replaced by clean black trousers, a crisp white shirt, and a well-tailored jacket. His dark hair was neatly combed and he'd trimmed his beard, revealing more of the strong line of his jaw. He stared at Zoe as she descended the stairs, momentarily speechless. "You look absolutely beautiful, Miss Alden," he finally managed, offering his arm as she reached the bottom step. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," she replied softly, taking his arm. "You're quite handsome yourself this evening." The ride to Clearwater Springs passed quickly, filled with easy conversation and occasional comfortable silences. As they approached the town, Zoe could hear the music drifting from the modest town hall, a lively fiddle accompanied by a piano and what sounded like a banjo. The hall was decorated with paper lanterns and wildflowers, giving the simple space a festive air. Several couples were already dancing, while others mingled around tables laden with food and drink brought by the townspeople. Mrs. Calloway from the general store spotted them first, hurrying over to greet Zoe with genuine warmth. "Miss Alden, how wonderful to see you again, and looking so well, too." "Thank you, Mrs. Calloway," Zoe replied. "I've been enjoying your copy of Jane Eyre immensely." "And Mr. Vance," Mrs. Calloway continued, a twinkle in her eye as she observed them together. "We were beginning to think you'd forgotten the way to town, as rarely as we see you at these gatherings." Ethan shifted slightly, his hand coming to rest protectively at the small of Zoe's back. Miss Alden expressed an interest in meeting more of the local community. "Did she now?" Mrs. Calloway's smile widened. "Well, you've come on the perfect evening. Nearly everyone from Clearwater Springs and the surrounding farms is here tonight." The next few hours passed in a blur of introductions, conversation, and dancing. Zoe found herself welcomed by the townsfolk with an openness she hadn't expected, many expressing interest in her background and training as a teacher. "San Antonio's gain is our loss," the town's mayor, a portly man named Jenkins, told her after learning of her intended position. "We've been trying to establish a proper school here for years." When the musicians struck up a waltz, Ethan appeared at her side, offering his hand. "Would you honor me with this dance, Miss Alden?" Zoe placed her hand in his, a small thrill running through her at the contact. "I'd be delighted, Mr. Vance." Ethan led her onto the floor with confidence, his hand firm at her waist as they began to move in time with the music. Despite his rugged appearance and occupation, he danced with surprising grace. "You dance very well," Zoe commented, looking up at him with newfound appreciation. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. My aunt insisted that all gentlemen should know how to waltz properly. I had lessons every Saturday for a year when I was 15. Zoe laughed softly, imagining a teenage Ethan reluctantly practicing dance steps. She sounds like a formidable woman. She was, he agreed, a fond expression crossing his features. She would have liked you, I think. The comment hung between them, laden with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Instead, they continued to dance, gradually moving closer until Zoe could feel the warmth of Ethan's body, smell the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to him. As the evening progressed, Zoe found herself dancing with several other men from the community: the doctor, the blacksmith, a young rancher named Thomas Collins who made his interest in her painfully obvious. But her eyes kept returning to Ethan, who watched her from across the room with an intensity that made her heart race. When they finally left the dance, the moon was high in the sky, casting silver light across the landscape as they drove back to the ranch. The night air was cool and Ethan draped a blanket over Zoe's shoulders, his fingers lingering longer than strictly necessary. "Did you enjoy yourself?" he asked, his voice low in the darkness. "Very much," Zoe replied honestly. "Everyone was so welcoming, it felt." She hesitated, searching for the right words. It felt like belonging somewhere, even if just for an evening. Ethan was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "You could belong here permanently if you wanted to." The statement hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Zoe's breath caught in her throat as she turned to look at him, but his expression was hidden in shadow. "I have a contract with the school in San Antonio," she said softly, her voice wavering slightly. Ethan nodded, the movement barely visible in the dim light. "Of course." "I didn't mean to presume." The remainder of the journey passed in silence, though not an uncomfortable one. Both were lost in their own thoughts, considering possibilities that had seemed unimaginable just weeks before. As July gave way to August, the reality of Zoe's impending departure began to cast a shadow over the peaceful routine they had established. The school board in San Antonio had written, inquiring about her health and confirming the start date for the term just 3 weeks away. Ethan found her on the porch one evening, the letter open in her lap as she stared out at the sunset painting the horizon in brilliant oranges and reds. "Bad news?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. Zoe shook her head. "Not bad, just a reminder of my obligations." Ethan nodded, understanding without her having to elaborate. "When will you leave?" "I should go next week," she said, her voice barely audible above the evening sounds of the ranch. "I'll need time to find lodgings and prepare for the school year." Ethan's hands tightened on the arms of his chair, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "I can take you to San Antonio myself. Ensure you arrive safely." "That's very kind, but I couldn't ask you to leave the ranch for so long." "You're not asking," Ethan interrupted gently. "I'm offering. Besides, I have business in San Antonio that I've been putting off." Zoe studied his face, wondering if this was true or merely an excuse to accompany her. Either way, she couldn't deny the relief she felt at not having to say goodbye to him just yet. "Then I accept, thank you." The days leading up to their departure passed too quickly. Zoe found herself memorizing the details of the ranch house, the way the light filtered through the kitchen windows in the morning, the sound of Ethan's boots on the porch steps when he returned from working with the cattle. Martha, observant as ever, found her in the garden the day before they were to leave for San Antonio. "He'll miss you something fierce," the housekeeper said without preamble, kneeling beside Zoe to help harvest late summer beans. Zoe's hands stilled. "I'll miss him too, all of you." Martha gave her a sidelong glance. "It's more than that, and you know it," she sighed, sitting back on her heels. "I've known Ethan Vance for 8 years, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. I don't know what to say to that," Zoe admitted, her heart racing at Martha's words. "You don't need to say anything to me," Martha replied, her voice softening. "But before you commit yourself to a life in San Antonio, you might want to consider what or who you'd be leaving behind." That night, sleep eluded Zoe. She paced her room, Martha's words echoing in her mind. The past month at the Vance Ranch had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. What had started as a desperate fight for survival had somehow transformed into a journey of a different kind, one leading not to San Antonio, but perhaps to a place she hadn't known she was seeking. Dawn was just breaking when Zoe finally made her decision. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, intending to find Ethan before her courage deserted her. The house was quiet, but a light in the kitchen suggested someone was already awake. Instead of Ethan, however, she found Martha preparing breakfast, her sleeves rolled up as she kneaded dough for biscuits. "You're up early," the housekeeper observed, though she didn't seem surprised. "I need to speak with Mr. Vance," Zoe said, twisting her hands nervously. "Do you know where I might find him?" A small smile played at the corners of Martha's mouth. "He's down at the spring. Said he wanted to check on something before your journey today." Zoe thanked her and hurried out, following the now familiar path to the hidden pool. The morning air was cool and fresh, promising another hot day ahead, but offering momentary respite from the Texas heat. She found Ethan seated on the same fallen log where they had shared lunch during her first visit to the spring. He looked up at her approach, surprise and pleasure mingling in his expression as he got to his feet. "Miss Alden, you're up early." "As are you," she replied, suddenly uncertain now that she stood before him. The speech she had rehearsed in her mind seemed to evaporate under his steady gaze. "I wanted to visit the spring once more before we leave," Ethan explained, gesturing to the peaceful scene around them. "It's always been a place for clear thinking." Zoe took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "That's why I'm here as well, to think clearly about what I want." Ethan's expression grew serious, a flicker of hope in his eyes that he quickly concealed. "And what is it that you want, Zoe?" The use of her given name, rare and intimate, gave her the final push she needed. "When you found me in the desert, I thought I was seeking a new life in San Antonio. A purpose, independence." She took a step closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of green in his hazel eyes. "But I've come to realize that what I was truly seeking wasn't a place on a map. It was this," she gestured around them to the spring, the ranch beyond, and finally to Ethan himself. "A sense of belonging, of home." Ethan remained very still, as if afraid any movement might shatter the moment. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I don't want to go to San Antonio," Zoe said softly. "Not if it means leaving you." The words hung in the air between them for a heartbeat before Ethan closed the distance, taking her hands in his. "I've been trying to find the courage to ask you to stay since the night of the dance," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "But I didn't want to stand in the way of the life you'd planned for yourself." "Plans change," Zoe said, squeezing his hands. "Sometimes for the better." Ethan's smile was radiant as he raised one hand to cup her cheek. "Zoe Alden, from the moment I found you in that desert, I think I knew my life would never be the same. These past weeks have only confirmed what my heart recognized immediately, that you belong here, with me. Is that a proposal, Mr. Vance?" Zoe asked, her voice teasing despite the tears that threatened to spill from her eyes. Ethan chuckled, the sound warm and full of joy. "Not exactly how I planned it, but yes." He grew serious again, his gaze holding hers. "I love you, Zoe. Will you stay? Be my wife. Help me build something even more beautiful here than what already exists." Zoe's answer was to rise on her tiptoes and press her lips to his, a kiss that spoke of newfound love and promises for the future. When they finally parted, both breathless, she whispered against his lips, "Yes. 1,000 times yes." They returned to the ranch house hand in hand, where Martha took one look at their radiant faces and burst into tears of joy, embracing them both. "I knew it," she declared, wiping her eyes with her apron. "I just knew from the moment he carried you through that door that you were meant for each other." Plans were quickly changed. Instead of a journey to San Antonio, Ethan rode to Clearwater Springs to send a telegram to the school board, explaining that Miss Alden would not be taking the position after all. He returned with news that both surprised and delighted Zoe. "Mayor Jenkins wants to speak with you," he told her over supper that evening. "It seems the town council has been discussing the school situation again, and your name came up." 2 days later, Zoe found herself in the mayor's office in Clearwater Springs, listening as he outlined a proposal that seemed almost too perfect to be true. "We've secured funding for a proper schoolhouse," Mayor Jenkins explained eagerly. "It won't be anything grand, mind you, but it will serve the children of Clearwater Springs and the surrounding ranches. What we need now is a teacher, someone qualified, dedicated, and already familiar with the challenges of life in this part of Texas." Zoe glanced at Ethan, who sat beside her with an encouraging smile. "And you're offering this position to me?" "Indeed we are, Miss Alden," the mayor confirmed. "The salary is modest, but we believe it's competitive with what San Antonio offered. Plus, you'd be helping establish something new, building an educational foundation for our community." The prospect was undeniably appealing. Teaching had always been Zoe's calling, and the opportunity to shape a school from its very beginning was one few educators ever received. "I would be honored to accept," she said finally, her decision made. "On one condition." Mayor Jenkins raised his eyebrows. "And what might that be?" "The school must be open to all children in the area," Zoe stated firmly, "regardless of their background or circumstances." The mayor exchanged glances with the council members present, then nodded. "We can agree to that, Miss Alden, or should I say the future Mrs. Vance." Word of their engagement had spread quickly through the small community, met with widespread approval and more than a few knowing smiles from those who had observed them together at the summer dance. The wedding took place in late August, a simple but joyous ceremony held at the spring that had become so significant in their relationship. The entire population of Clearwater Springs seemed to attend, along with ranchers and farmers from miles around, all eager to celebrate the union of the respected rancher and the schoolteacher who had quite literally been rescued from death's door. Zoe wore a dress of cream-colored silk that Martha had helped alter from her best city gown, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Ethan, resplendent in a new suit ordered from San Antonio, watched with undisguised adoration as she walked toward him through the dappled sunlight beneath the trees. The local justice of the peace performed the ceremony, his words nearly drowned out at times by the gentle sound of water flowing from the spring and the occasional distant lowing of cattle. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan drew Zoe into a kiss that prompted cheers and a few good-natured whistles from the assembled guests. The celebration continued well into the evening, with tables set up near the ranch house laden with food contributed by every household in the area. There was dancing under the stars, music provided by the same musicians who had played at the summer social, and enough goodwill to make the night seem magical. As the last guests departed, Ethan led his new wife back to the house, their house now, in every sense. Martha had discreetly made herself scarce, announcing her intention to stay with her sister in town for a few days to give the newlyweds privacy. Alone at last, Ethan drew Zoe into his arms in the doorway of their bedroom. "Happy, Mrs. Vance?" he asked softly, searching her face in the dim lamplight. Zoe's smile was radiant as she reached up to trace the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she admitted. "When my wagon broke down in the desert, I thought it was the end of everything. I never imagined it would be just the beginning." Ethan caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "You found me just as much as I found you," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "Or perhaps we found each other." "Either way," Zoe murmured as he lowered his lips to hers, "we both found exactly what we needed." The Clearwater Springs School opened its doors in early October, a modest building with large windows that allowed the Texas sunshine to flood the interior. Zoe stood at the entrance on the first day, welcoming 15 children ranging in age from 6 to 14, the sons and daughters of ranchers, farmers, and townspeople alike. Among them were 2 children from a Mexican family that worked at a neighboring ranch and a half Apache boy, whose mother had married a local blacksmith. True to her word, Zoe welcomed them all with equal warmth and enthusiasm, setting the tone for a school where learning would be available to anyone who sought it. Ethan had surprised her with a gift that first morning, a small bell to call the children to class, cast from silver mined in the Texas hills, and engraved with her initials and the date of the school's founding. "Every proper school needs a bell," he'd said as he presented it to her, his eyes warm with pride. "And every proper schoolteacher needs something to make herself heard." Life settled into a rhythm that suited them both. Zoe taught during the week, riding to and from the school on a gentle mare that had been a wedding gift from Ethan. In the evenings, she would often sit on the porch with her husband, sharing stories from her day while he listened with genuine interest. Weekends were devoted to the ranch and to each other. Ethan taught Zoe more about cattle ranching than she had ever expected to learn, while she introduced him to books and ideas he had never encountered during his years of hard work building his empire in the Texas wilderness. The first Christmas they celebrated as husband and wife brought a snowfall rare for that part of Texas, a light dusting that transformed the landscape into a wonderland for a few magical hours. Standing at the window of their bedroom, watching the flakes drift down in the pre-dawn light, Zoe felt Ethan's arms encircle her from behind, his chin resting on top of her head. "Merry Christmas, my love," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her hair. Zoe leaned back against his solid warmth, covering his hands with hers where they rested on her stomach. "I have a gift for you," she said softly, "one that can't be wrapped." Ethan went very still, his breath catching as he understood her meaning. "Are you certain?" Turning in his arms to face him, Zoe nodded, her eyes shining with joy. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby, Ethan. By summer's end, there will be a new Vance at the ranch." The look of wonder that spread across Ethan's face was something Zoe knew she would remember for the rest of her life. He gathered her close, his strong hands infinitely gentle as they splayed across her back. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Our child." "Our child," Zoe agreed, reaching up to brush away the tears that had escaped to trail down his weathered cheeks. "A new life. Another beginning." The news of the coming baby spread quickly through Clearwater Springs, met with the same enthusiasm that had greeted their marriage. Martha returned to her position at the ranch with renewed vigor, determined that everything should be perfect for the arrival of the Vance heir. "I've helped bring more than 30 babies into this world," she informed Zoe one afternoon as they prepared the nursery, transforming a small room adjacent to the master bedroom. "And I've never lost a mother or child yet." Zoe was grateful for the older woman's experience and calm demeanor as her body changed with the advancing pregnancy. By late spring, her condition was obvious, prompting the town council to hire a young woman as her assistant at the school, with the understanding that she would take over classes temporarily after the baby's birth. Ethan was attentiveness itself during those months, ensuring that Zoe never overexerted herself while being careful not to treat her as an invalid. He seemed to sense instinctively when she needed help, and when she needed independence, a balance that strengthened their already deep bond. On a sweltering August evening in 1876, almost exactly a year after Ethan had found Zoe stranded in the desert, their son came into the world after a difficult but ultimately successful labor. Martha served as midwife, with Ethan pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door until the sound of a newborn's cry sent him rushing inside. Zoe lay exhausted but triumphant, cradling their son in her arms. The baby had a shock of dark hair like his father's, and when he briefly opened his eyes, revealed the same startling blue as his mother's. "He's perfect," Ethan whispered, perching carefully on the edge of the bed to gaze in awe at the tiny face. "Absolutely perfect." "William Ethan Vance," Zoe said softly, having decided on the name months earlier, "after your father and you." Ethan swallowed hard, clearly moved by the gesture. A fine name for a fine boy. He leaned in to kiss her forehead gently. Thank you, my love, for everything." The years that followed brought prosperity to both the Vance Ranch and the growing town of Clearwater Springs. Under Ethan's careful management, the ranch expanded, adding more land and cattle until it became one of the most successful operations in the county. Zoe's school flourished as well, eventually requiring a larger building and additional teachers as more families settled in the area. Their family grew too. William was joined by a sister, Elizabeth Martha, in 1878, and another brother, James Robert, in 1881. Each child brought new joy to the ranch, filling the house with laughter, and the kind of happy chaos that Ethan and Zoe had both once thought might never be theirs. Through it all, the spring remained their special place, a retreat where they could find moments of peace together amid their busy lives, and where they eventually taught their children to swim in the clear, cool water. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Ethan surprised Zoe with a small stone bench placed beside the pool, engraved with their initials and a simple inscription, "Where two souls found their oasis." Standing beside it, his arm around her waist as they watched their children splash in the water under Martha's watchful eye, Ethan pressed a kiss to his wife's temple. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. "About the life you might have had if your wagon hadn't broken down that day?" Zoe turned to face him, noting the silver now prominent in his dark hair, the laugh lines that framed his eyes that still looked at her with the same adoration they had a decade ago. "Not a single one," she replied with absolute certainty. "I thought I was seeking a new beginning in San Antonio, but fate had something far better in mind." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the familiar contours. "You found me stranded in the desert, Ethan Vance, but I found the oasis I'd been seeking all along." As the Texas sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they stood together by the spring that had brought them together, rancher and schoolteacher, husband and wife, partners in a love that had transformed both their lives in ways neither could have imagined on that scorching summer day when destiny had led them to each other in the vast Texas wilderness. The years continued to pass, bringing changes both expected and surprising. By 1885, Clearwater Springs had grown from a modest settlement to a thriving community with its own railway station, connecting it to San Antonio and beyond. The Vance Ranch expanded accordingly, adapting to new methods of cattle raising while maintaining the quality that had built its reputation. William, at 9 years old, was already showing a keen interest in the ranch operations, following his father around whenever school allowed and absorbing knowledge about cattle and land management like a sponge. Elizabeth, 7 and precocious, had inherited her mother's love of learning and could often be found with her nose in a book, while 3-year-old James toddled after his siblings, determined not to be left out of any adventure. Zoe's school had become the pride of the community, with 3 full-time teachers including herself, and a new building that featured separate classrooms for different age groups. Several of her former students had gone on to further education in San Antonio, or even as far as St. Louis, returning with knowledge and skills that benefited the growing town. On a crisp autumn day in 1885, as Zoe sat on the porch grading student essays, she looked up to see a familiar figure approaching on horseback. Even after a decade of marriage, the sight of Ethan returning home still caused her heart to quicken. He dismounted with the same fluid grace that had always characterized his movements, though he now occasionally complained of stiffness in his right knee, where an old war injury troubled him in cold weather. "You're home early," she observed as he climbed the steps to join her, bending to kiss her in greeting. "Good reason," he replied, settling into the chair beside hers. "Got a telegram from the railroad company. They want to purchase grazing rights along the eastern section of our land." Zoe set aside her papers, giving him her full attention. "For what purpose?" "They're planning a spur line to connect the mines north of here directly to the main track," Ethan explained. "It would cut across the corner of our property land we don't use much for cattle anyway because of the rocky terrain. And they're offering A slow smile spread across Ethan's face. Enough to build that new barn we've been talking about with plenty left over. Zoe returned his smile, reaching over to take his hand. That's wonderful news. There's more, Ethan continued, his expression growing more serious. The mayor stopped me in town. The council wants to establish a proper high school for Clearwater Springs. They're hoping you'll consider taking on the role of headmistress. Surprise and pleasure mingled in Zoe's expression. A high school? Here. The town's growing, Ethan reminded her. There are enough young people now to justify it. And who better to lead it than the woman who built our educational system from nothing? Zoe sat back, considering the opportunity. Her current role as principal of the elementary school kept her busy, but the challenge of creating a secondary school from the ground up was undeniably appealing. I'd need to hire more teachers, she mused, already planning. And we'd need a proper building with a laboratory for sciences. Ethan chuckled, recognizing the familiar light of determination in his wife's eyes. I take it you're interested. Very, she confirmed. Though it would mean less time at home, at least initially. The children are growing up, Ethan said gently. William's in school most of the day now, Elizabeth too, and Martha's more than capable of keeping an eye on James when we're both busy. He squeezed her hand. You've supported my dreams for this ranch from the beginning. How could I do any less for yours? That evening, as they shared the news with their children over dinner, William looked up from his plate with a serious expression. If Mother's going to build a high school, will I get to attend it? He asked, calculation evident in his blue eyes. Eventually, Zoe replied, smiling at her eldest son's ambition. Once you've completed your elementary education. And then university, William pressed, making Ethan raise his eyebrows in surprise. University? That's thinking far ahead, son. William shrugged, the gesture so like his father's that Zoe had to suppress a smile. Mr. Thompson says I have a good head for figures. He thinks I could study engineering. Mr. Thompson, the station master at Clearwater Springs, had taken an interest in William's education, often allowing the boy to observe the workings of the railway telegraph and explaining the mathematics behind the train schedules. Engineering would be a fine profession, Ethan acknowledged, a hint of pride in his voice. Though I had hoped you might want to take over the ranch someday. I do, William assured him quickly, but maybe I could make it better with new ideas. Like those windmills they're using up north to pump water. Ethan and Zoe exchanged glances over their son's head, a silent communication perfected over years of partnership. Their children would have opportunities neither of them had dreamed of at their age, the blend of ranch life and education creating possibilities that spanned both worlds. Later that night, after the children were asleep, they stood together on the porch, gazing up at the star-filled Texas sky. Did you ever imagine this? Zoe asked softly, leaning against Ethan's solid warmth. When you found me half dead in the desert, did you have any idea what we would build together? Ethan's arm tightened around her shoulders. Not specifically, he admitted. But I knew from the moment you opened those blue eyes and looked at me that my life had changed course. He turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. You brought life to this ranch, Zoe, not just through our children but through your spirit, your determination. We brought life to it together, she corrected gently, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw, now bearing a distinguished touch of gray in his beard. This was always your dream, I just helped shape it. Ethan shook his head, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. No, my love. The ranch was my work, my livelihood. But you and the children, you're my dream. Everything else is just the setting. As winter gave way to spring, and spring to the heat of another Texas summer, the plans for both the railroad spur and the Clearwater Springs High School progressed. Construction began on a modest but well-designed school building on the north side of town, with Zoe overseeing every detail from the arrangement of classrooms to the selection of textbooks. Ethan, meanwhile, negotiated the terms of the railroad's use of their land, securing not only a fair price but also guarantees about water access, and the construction of proper cattle crossings where the tracks would intersect grazing areas. In August of 1886, just after their 12th wedding anniversary, Zoe found herself standing in the completed high school building, surveying the empty classrooms that would soon be filled with students. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, a feature she had insisted upon, remembering the darkness of some of the schools she had attended as a girl. The sound of footsteps in the corridor alerted her to another presence, and she turned to find Ethan watching her from the doorway, his expression one of unconcealed pride. "It's magnificent," he said simply, entering the room to stand beside her. "You've created something special here, Zoe." "We all did," she corrected, gesturing to include the town beyond the windows. "The whole community came together to make this happen." "But it was your vision," Ethan insisted. "Your determination that a small cattle town in the middle of Texas could offer education to rival any city school." Zoe smiled, acknowledging the truth in his words. "Perhaps, but I couldn't have done it without your support." She paused, glancing around the room once more before turning back to her husband. "Do you remember what Mayor Jenkins said when they first offered me the teaching position in Clearwater Springs? That I would be building an educational foundation for the community?" Ethan nodded. "And now look what you've built." "What we've built," Zoe corrected again, taking his hand. "All of it the ranch, the schools, our family. We created it together, Ethan, stone by stone, day by day." The first term at Clearwater Springs High School opened with 28 students and 3 teachers, including Zoe herself. The curriculum was ambitious for a small town school, including not only the standard subjects, but also practical courses in agriculture and business that would serve the students well whether they remained in Clearwater Springs or ventured beyond. As autumn painted the landscape in golds and reds, the railroad spur was completed, bringing increased commerce and new faces to the town. The Vance Ranch benefited from the improved transportation, with cattle shipments now more efficient and supplies more readily available. Life settled into a new rhythm, busy but fulfilling. Zoe divided her time between the school and home, while Ethan managed the expanding ranch operations with William increasingly at his side, the boy's interest in both cattle and engineering growing with each passing month. One evening in late November, as the first cold front of winter swept across Texas, Ethan returned from town with an unexpected visitor, a distinguished-looking gentleman with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard who introduced himself as Dr. Lawrence Hamilton from the State Education Board. "Dr. Hamilton has been visiting schools across the state," Ethan explained as they settled in the parlor after dinner. "The board is conducting a survey of educational facilities, particularly in rural areas. And I must say, Mrs. Vance, Dr. Hamilton added, accepting a cup of coffee from Martha, your schools have exceeded all expectations. The reports reaching Austin have been impressive, but seeing your work firsthand is truly remarkable." Zoe felt a flush of pride at his words. "Thank you, Dr. Hamilton. We've been fortunate to have a supportive community and excellent teachers. And exceptional leadership," the doctor noted, "which brings me to the purpose of my visit, beyond the standard assessment." He set his cup down carefully. "The state board is establishing a commission to develop standardized curricula for rural schools throughout Texas. We're seeking educators with practical experience in building successful programs in challenging environments." Ethan glanced at Zoe, immediately understanding the implications. "And you want my wife to serve on this commission?" Dr. Hamilton nodded. "Indeed, Mr. Vance. Mrs. Vance's achievements here make her an ideal candidate. The position would require occasional travel to Austin for meetings, but most of the work could be done by correspondence." Zoe sat very still, absorbing the offer. To have her work recognized at the state level, to have the opportunity to influence education beyond Clearwater Springs, it was more than she had ever aspired to. "I'm honored by your consideration, Dr. Hamilton," she said carefully. "But I would need to discuss this with my family before making any decision." "Of course," the doctor replied, rising to his feet. "I'll be in town until tomorrow afternoon. Perhaps you could give me your answer then." He turned to Ethan. "Mr. Vance, I wonder if I might trouble you for a tour of your ranch tomorrow morning. I've heard it's one of the most progressive operations in the county." After their guest had been shown to the guest room, Ethan and Zoe retreated to their bedroom, where they could speak privately. "You should accept," Ethan said without preamble, sitting on the edge of their bed as Zoe brushed out her hair at the dressing table. "It's an incredible opportunity, Zoe." She met his eyes in the mirror. "It would mean time away from home from you and the children." "Occasional meetings in Austin," Ethan corrected. "Nothing we can't manage. The children are older now, and as Dr. Hamilton said, most of the work can be done by correspondence." Zoe set down her brush, turning to face him directly. "You really think I should do this?" Ethan crossed to her, taking her hands in his as he drew her to her feet. "I think you've worked tirelessly to build something extraordinary here, and now you have a chance to help other communities do the same." His eyes held hers, sincere and supportive. "You found your purpose here, Zoe. First as a teacher, then as my wife and the mother of our children, and now as an educational leader recognized beyond our little corner of Texas. And you wouldn't mind the disruption to our routine, the times I would be away." Ethan shook his head, his smile gentle. "When I found you in that desert, half dead and still fighting, I knew you were a woman of uncommon strength and determination. I fell in love with that spirit as much as with your beauty or your kindness." He reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "How could I possibly mind seeing that spirit recognized and valued by others?" The next morning, Zoe informed Dr. Hamilton that she would be honored to serve on the commission. The doctor departed with a promise to send formal documentation and details of the first meeting, scheduled for February in Austin. As winter deepened and Christmas approached, the Vance household bustled with activity. The children were excited about the holiday, particularly William, who had requested books on engineering as his gift. Elizabeth had developed a passion for the piano. Practicing diligently on the instrument Ethan had purchased for her 8th birthday, while James, now 4, filled the house with energy and increasingly complex questions about everything from stars to cattle breeding. On Christmas Eve, after the children had finally been persuaded to go to bed with promises that Santa Claus would not come until they were asleep, Ethan and Zoe sat before the fireplace, enjoying a rare moment of quiet. "Remember our first Christmas together?" Ethan asked, his arm around Zoe's shoulders as they watched the flames dance. "When you told me about William," Zoe smiled at the memory. "How could I forget? The look on your face was priceless." "I couldn't believe my good fortune," Ethan admitted. "Finding you, marrying you, and then learning we would have a child together, it felt like more happiness than any man deserved." "And now look at us," Zoe said softly. 3 beautiful children, the ranch thriving, the schools established." She turned to look at him, her expression earnest. "We've built a good life, Ethan." "The best life," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And it all began with a broken wagon wheel in the middle of nowhere." As the clock in the hall chimed midnight, marking the arrival of Christmas Day, 1886, Zoe leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder, content in the knowledge that the oasis they had created together, a haven of love, purpose, and possibility in the vast Texas landscape, would continue to flourish and grow with each passing year, nourishing not only themselves and their children, but the entire community that had become part of their extended family. "Merry Christmas, my love," Ethan murmured, his voice warm with the affection that had only deepened through 12 years of marriage. "Merry Christmas," Zoe replied, her heart full as she gazed up at the man who had once found her stranded in the desert and had since helped her build a life more fulfilling than any she could have imagined. And here's to many, many more. Outside, a light snow began to fall, rare for Texas, but somehow fitting for this night of reflection and gratitude. Tomorrow would bring the joyful chaos of Christmas morning with the children, followed by the arrival of friends from town for dinner. But for now, in the quiet warmth of their home, Ethan and Zoe Vance held each other close, secure in the knowledge that what they had found together was indeed the greatest gift of all.